America, the 1930s were perhaps the golden age of hardened outlaws. But it was also the decade that saw the rise and inevitable fall of villains like Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson. According to FBI criminal records, Babyface Nelson began his life of crime by living on the streets of Chicago with a group of tough teenagers and was first imprisoned in 1922 at the age of 14. Babyface Nelson's life of crime ended when he was shot in the head at the age of 25. But before that, he was considered by authorities to be one of the most ruthless killers in America. As a criminal who was later described by social commentators as something worse than a nightmare, Lester Joseph Gillis was the most annoying and stubborn criminal on the streets of Chicago, USA during the Great Depression. This assassin, nicknamed Baby Nelson, was the one who killed the most FBI agents in the criminal world. Despite his small body, with a punch as heavy as steel and a cold-blooded killer instinct, Lester even made his comrades tremble in fear. The criminal of nightmares. Chicago, USA during the years of the Great Depression was a gray picture with car thieves on the street, the most reckless criminals. On December 6, 1908, when the darkness had cleared, signaling the end of a nightmare for criminals, it was also the time when a new nightmare was born. The baby's cry broke the silence of the night in the apartment where the Gillis family lived at 944 North California Avenue. From birth, Lester lived in a difficult environment. The family was poor. Lester's parents, Joseph and Mary, were mountain people from Margaree, Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, Canada. Immigrated to California, they were rustic and poor, unable to adapt to life here. Joseph worked as a porter up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week at construction sites for low wages. That was nothing strange to people like Joseph. They had to work hard doing dirty jobs to earn a small amount of money. His wife, Mary, was an educated woman, intelligent in many fields, but did not understand her children. She tutored French for rich children. The couple buried themselves in work and could not have time to raise their children. Mary let her boys roam the streets without control. Lester Joseph Gillis entered the world as a very unpleasant child, always angry with life. From birth to later, people never saw him have a moment without resentment towards someone. Later social commentators likened Lester Gillis to something worse than a nightmare, but it was not the social factors that pushed Lester. His brothers and sisters, although living in the same environment, were not as corrupt as Lester. They accepted reality and always lived with poverty with a resignation. They avoided clashes with neighbors, calmly went to school without the slightest resistance, regularly went to church with their parents every Sunday, and always lived by their parents' teachings. Starved but clean, ragged but fragrant. Meanwhile, Lester quickly became a stubborn child to the point of being incorrigible. In his early years, Lester was acquainted with hundreds of bad kids on the street because he always liked to run away from home to play. As Lester's friends at St. Bridge School grew up, Lester seemed to forget that. He was only 1.6 m tall at best. Being a stunted child, Lester became an easy prey for the older kids to bully. Moreover, his blue eyes and angelic chubby face made the bullies of the same age like to give Lester many scars on his face, sometimes with a baton, sometimes with a baseball bat, sometimes with a brick. Lester, in his early years, seemed to have only known hell. Suffering too many painful blows, Lester began to fight back. Although he was much shorter and dozens of kilograms lighter than his opponents, the resentment seemed to give Lester invisible power. The boy did not receive any good things, but in return the devil gave Lester what he needed. Those were the hands that bruised the faces of his friends. Those who bullied him, Lester punched them until their noses bled. Gradually, the group of big guys became terrified of the fierce reactions of a small animal cornered. Lester quickly became someone everyone had to avoid at all costs. Having won over a group of juniors, he rampaged through his neighborhood. Lester caused trouble everywhere. Smashing windows, stealing from stores, robbing supermarkets, stealing cars, and bullying the weak. When they realized their son had become a delinquent, Lester's parents desperately tried to discipline him. Their efforts, along with the support of the priest and the nun at school, failed to change Lester. Persuasion, shouting, threats were all in vain. He felt nothing. When his father changed his methods and resorted to beatings, Lester ran away. Many times Lester returned home with the police for stealing or robbing. His parents welcomed their stubborn son with open arms because they thought it was better to have a rebellious son than to cry when they saw his chair or seat empty at every meal. They ignored him when he skipped school, accepting that he came home only to sleep. In the FBI's file, Lester was listed as a delinquent at the age of 14. After stealing a car, the boy was sent to a reform school. Released after nearly 2 years, Lester clearly learned nothing there. He immediately returned to street life, always wearing a switchblade and carrying a crowbar to wait for an opportunity to break into cars. The rebellious boy, a future notorious criminal, was once again sent to prison for shoplifting. In 1926, Lester was released from prison, continuing his years of crime and gradually becoming a nightmare in the Chicago underworld. Since his release, Lester has gathered a number of thugs to form a protection racket. They approach stores demanding that owners buy insurance against bullets, theft, bankruptcy, and even death. The insurance customers of Lester's gang are mostly pawn shops, bookmakers, and brothel owners. Those who do not buy insurance will have their stores burned down, employees attacked, and even family members affected. Of course, everyone implicitly understood that all those disasters were caused by the protection racket to the business if it refused to buy insurance. And from that moment on, Lester quickly became a famous gangster. The Chicago underworld in the 1920s was largely controlled by crime boss Alphonse Capone. Capone, a notorious gangster in New York. In 1919, he moved to Chicago to operate. In a short time, Capone took control of the underworld there. Part of his success was due to his good relationships with the police and prominent politicians. Capone became rich and took control of almost all industries and most of the workforce. Some said that Capone owned the whole city. Lester's reputation in Chicago attracted Capone's attention, and Capone wanted Lester to join his gang. As soon as he was released from prison in 1926, Lester joined a gang that specialized in protecting illegal businesses. The scale of operations in these places was still quite small. When asked to join Capone's world, Lester did not hesitate to agree and felt honored. While Lester preferred to use his fists, always carrying knives and guns to be ready to fight, Capone's gang tended to solve things in their own peaceful way, avoiding direct conflicts that attracted the attention of the police. After a few times of acting rashly, Lester was warned quite a lot. He felt that he was not suitable for Capone's gang. Lester intended to leave the group. Lester felt more comfortable and confident when always carrying a gun with him. He started to switch to armed robbery. Everything became quite easy for Lester. Lester fell in love with an 18-year-old girl named Helen Wawrzyniak and was considering getting married. But for Lester, money was something more necessary than anything, so he wanted to have a lot of money before starting a family. Just before Christmas 1930, Lester and Capone's gang made a big break-in at a famous jewelry store in the suburb of Wheaton, Illinois. The heist netted Lester $5,000, more money than Lester had ever made before. Lester spent the money on a valuable ring to propose to Helen. Things seemed to be going well for him. In January 1931, Lester was arrested while attempting to rob another jewelry store. This third arrest, Lester was investigated for his involvement in the famous robbery in Wheaton and was at risk of facing a sentence of 25 to 30 years in prison. A bleak future for Lester Gillis. Helen, Lester's wife, visited him very often. Later, when Lester escaped, the police suspected that Helen's visits to Lester were purposeful. Hello everyone, let's continue to part 2 of the story about the criminal journey of criminal Lester Joseph Gillis, nicknamed Baby Nelson Face. On the morning of February 17, 1932, Lester was escorted to Wheaton to be tried for the jewelry robbery that year. When returning to Joliet, at a rest stop he pretended to be nauseous. When the handcuffs were removed in the bathroom, he successfully escaped. A few months after Lester escaped, the police suspected him of being involved in a number of car thefts, starting in Chicago and ending up in Reno, Nevada. Lester sought out Joe Parente, a well-known gangster, for a new job. His previous work for the Capone gang made the tough Joe Parente accept the offer quickly. Lester was assigned to do a variety of jobs, from bodyguarding to bartending, to valet parking at upscale clubs. He was highly regarded by Parente during that time and agreed to join the liquor smuggling group. Lester began operating under the name George Nelson. Lester was quite successful and made a name for himself while working for Joe Parente. However, the name Lester George Nelson really became known when he went into business with John Dillinger, the notorious robber, legendary for his bank robberies in America. Lester was wise enough to know that robbing a bank required its own art, experience, and trustworthy members. George wanted to cooperate with John Dillinger, but initially encountered some obstacles from a person who was quite important to John. That was Van Meter. Van Meter met John Dillinger in Michigan State Prison. He was a man with a cold face, who had carried out the first bank robberies in the Great Lakes area with John Dillinger. Van Meter always had a clear attitude in business cooperation, suitable and unsuitable. He really disliked George Nelson from the beginning and called Nelson Squid. Van Meter once roared right in a bar when he heard Nelson wanted to join the Dillinger gang and mocked Nelson. "Your face looks so young." Van Meter's words made Nelson really angry. His hand clenched the gun and wanted to shoot Van Meter, but he restrained himself because he thought that joining Dillinger was the most important thing. "I think it's a good proposal," Nelson tried to calmly reply. Leaving the bar, Nelson and his friend Chase planned to contact some of their old subjects, determined to successfully rob banks to prove that their proposal to join Dillinger was correct and that they could be more successful than this gang. There is not much specific information about the activities of the Lester Nelson gang at this time. People only know that the gang moved quite quickly, operating between 3 areas of Wisconsin, Iowa, and Nebraska. They attacked banks in small towns and always left with a sack of money. Nelson's gang included 2 bank robbery experts, named Tommy Carroll and Eddie Green. Nelson learned a lot from working with them: how to control security guards, customers, and tellers, how to collect money at the counters, and how to safely leave the car with the money. The police began to notice the name Babyface Nelson with his famous bank robberies. Nelson did not like this nickname associated with his career. Nelson's gang and John Dillinger's gang operated almost in parallel. The press sometimes confused the operations of these 2 gangs. The gang's headquarters was St. Paul's Church in Minnesota. They hid here, divided the money, and discussed plans for the next operations. They operated openly because they had in their hands many famous officials of the police department here, a police department famous for corruption in the 1930s. When he had a lot of money, Nelson spent a lot of time with his young wife, Helen. The 2 lived almost exclusively at the upscale St. Francis Hotel and frequently visited the Granada Club at night. By this time, the name Babyface Nelson had become quite famous. It was Van Meter, who had once flatly rejected Nelson, who was forced to invite Nelson to join the Dillinger gang in February 1934. The first meeting took place at the St. Francis Hotel, a top-class hotel with the participation of all members from the 2 gangs. Nelson appeared with a new look. His face no longer had the childish look that Van Meter had commented. Many agreements were made between the 2 sides. They began to work together in famous robberies and created nightmares for the banking system at that time. After a series of bank robberies, the names John Dillinger and Lester Gillis Babyface Nelson topped the police's wanted list. To avoid the pursuit of the police, the gang of John Dillinger and Nelson temporarily disbanded for a while. They operated less with small robberies just to maintain the gang, no longer aiming to build a reputation. Until mid-April 1934, the members of the gang were summoned to a motel in northern Wisconsin to plan their activities again, attacking banks on a larger scale despite the FBI's pursuit. Later, this motel became a safe haven for the gang. The police had a hard time locating this place. However, the frequent visits of the gang here made the motel owner suspicious. He wondered why rich people like them would choose a remote place like this to rest. After making sure that Babyface Nelson and John Dillinger were present in his motel, he proactively contacted the local police and the FBI to report this. Lieutenant Melvin Purvis, a senior FBI agent then in Chicago, quickly mobilized more than 40 Midwestern FBI agents to assemble at Rhinelander, then moved to Bohemia Lodge. Together with local police, all quickly headed to northern Wisconsin where the Dillinger gang was hiding. Luck smiled on Nelson and the Dillinger gang. On the way to northern Wisconsin, the police encountered major problems when their vehicle had problems. Only 2 miles from the motel, the sound of engine failure made the whole area aware of what was happening. From the motel, 3 men hurriedly drove away. The police thought the suspects were trying to escape. They quickly opened fire and wounded 3 people in the car. They were real tourists. The gunshots in the middle of the night in such a remote place made experienced people like Nelson and John Dillinger immediately guess that the police had appeared. Dillinger, Van Meter, who were sitting together, quickly left the room, taking the fastest way out into the woods behind. Even Nelson and Helen, who were sleeping, quickly left before the police arrived. Helen was the only one who stayed. There was no confrontation with the police. Later, Nelson left for California. He had heard news about John Dillinger. On Sunday night, July 22, 1934, John Dillinger fell into a trap set by the FBI at a movie theater in Chicago. John was betrayed by a woman. He was shot and killed while trying to escape. Helen was arrested by the police at the motel but was released 3 weeks later. She quickly contacted her husband in California. Nelson tried to contact John Paul Chase, an old friend of his, to form a new gang. However, after learning that several of his former associates, such as Eddie Green and Tommy Carroll, had been killed, he put his plans on hold. Nelson and Helen stayed on the West Coast during the summer of 1934. After the death of John Dillinger, things did not go well for Nelson. Nelson was wanted everywhere by the FBI. The underworld seemed to have turned against him. He put his plans to hit banks on hold. Through information from witnesses and FBI inspectors, Cowley soon determined that Nelson often traveled on the Northern Illinois Highway, which connects Chicago to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. However, the police were unable to locate Nelson's car for a long time, which made Inspector Cowley really angry. Cowley personally monitored all the cameras on the main roads in the hope that Nelson's car would appear. In the early afternoon of November 27, 1934, FBI agents were surprised to receive information that Babyface Nelson was located about 60 miles from Chicago. A few minutes later, another agent spotted him driving a stolen police car with a different license plate. That was the moment when Babyface Nelson's ruthless, murderous life ended. Shortly thereafter, Inspector Cowley received urgent information that Babyface Nelson might be heading toward Chicago in a stolen police car. Cowley immediately dispatched 2 agents, Bill Ryan and Tom McDade, to find Nelson's car and climbed into the second car with Agent Herman Ed Hollis. Thus, just over an hour after the FBI's initial encounter with Babyface Nelson, 2 agents, Ryan and McDade, quickly spotted Nelson driving on the highway and a fierce pursuit began. Gunshots rang out and Agent Ryan managed to shoot the radiator of the car Nelson was driving and then drove straight ahead to block the cold-blooded killer. From there, Agents Cowley and Hollis drove past Nelson on the freeway and began following him. With the car disabled, Nelson pulled over at the entrance to Northside Park in Barrington, Illinois. Cowley and Hollis immediately stopped about 50 yards from Babyface Nelson. Nelson and Chase opened fire before the agents could get out of their vehicle. The 4 to 5 minute gunfight claimed the life of Agent Hollis. Agent Cowley was also seriously wounded in the fight. Babyface Nelson suffered 17 gunshot wounds and was helped into a stolen FBI car by his accomplice John Paul Chase. Finally, due to his numerous wounds, Babyface Nelson breathed his last at about 8 p.m. in Wilmette, Illinois. Agent Cowley, although he survived the initial shooting, did not live to see the next day. He died early in the morning of November 28, 1934. Later that day, following an anonymous tip, FBI agents found Babyface Nelson's body in a ditch next to a cemetery near Niles Center, Illinois. Nelson's wife Helen survived the horrific gunfight by hiding in a field to avoid the hail of bullets flying between the fugitives and the FBI agents. The FBI arrested Helen 2 days after the fateful battle. Helen was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in a federal female correctional facility located about 50 miles outside Detroit, Michigan. After her release, Helen changed her name and left Michigan.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content. And as always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one.